It was 11:30 on a Tuesday morning when I spotted a bright red envelope wedged in with my normal mail. The words "Final Notice" were splashed across the front in massive bold letters that could have been read from the moon. Inside was a demand from the Riverside Estates HOA insisting I owed $25,000 in accumulated fines for unauthorized construction and property violations at my lakeside cabin. The funny part was my cabin sat more than 3 miles outside their jurisdiction on land my grandfather purchased back in 1964. By the time the chaos wrapped up, 6 months later, the entire HOA board would be standing in front of a county judge while their president faced criminal fraud charges. My name is David Preston, and I work as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm downtown. 5 years ago, I bought a modest home in Riverside Estates, mainly because it was close to work and offered good schools for when I eventually started a family. But my true escape was the cabin on Lake Morrison that I inherited from my grandfather. Every weekend I could manage, I would retreat there to a peaceful world of birdsong and water, gently tapping the dock. It was where I could forget about permits, codes, and petty neighborhood politics. Trouble began when Karen Peaton became president of the Riverside Estates HOA. Karen was a former bank manager who had retired early and apparently decided ruling the neighborhood like her own private kingdom would fill the emptiness in her life. She wore power suits even to weekend board meetings and carried a clipboard like it was a crown scepter. Within her first month, she tripled the number of violation notices sent out and launched something she called proactive compliance walks, where she patrolled the neighborhood, searching for any infraction. I landed on her radar when she saw me loading fishing gear into my truck one Friday afternoon. She strode over with her clipboard and in a syrupy sweet tone asked if I had submitted the proper vehicle modification form for the rod holders in my truck bed. I politely told her the truck was my personal property and the HOA had zero authority over vehicle modifications. Her smile stiffened and she jotted something down before walking off without another word. The following Monday, I received my first notice, but it had nothing to do with the truck. Instead, it accused me of excessive noise from construction activities at my secondary property. The letter claimed multiple residents had complained about hammering and power tools disturbing their weekends, which was curious since I had not done any construction at the cabin in over 2 years. When I called the HOA office, the secretary sounded confused and said Karen herself had filed the complaint based on her own observations. I ignored it, thinking it was a simple mistake, but the notices just kept coming. Every week brought a fresh violation notice about the cabin. Accusations ranged from non-approved exterior paint colors to an illegal dock extension to failing to maintain landscaping according to community standards and unauthorized watercraft storage. Each notice carried escalating fines, starting at $100 and doubling every time the letters became more aggressive, packed with legal-sounding threats about liens and court action. After 2 months of this ridiculous harassment, I drove to the HOA office with a folder full of documents. I spread property maps and tax records across the conference table and explained to Karen and 2 board members that my cabin was located on unincorporated county land far outside the Riverside Estates boundaries. Karen barely looked at the papers before sliding them back with a manicured finger. In a condescending tone, she claimed the HOA had recently expanded its area of influence to include properties that affected the visual and environmental quality of the community. I asked to see the legal documentation of this expansion. She replied that the board had voted on it in a special session, and it was perfectly legitimate. When I requested copies of the meeting minutes and legal filings, she told me those documents were confidential and only available to board members. Then she stood and announced that unless I began paying the accumulated fines immediately, the HOA would pursue aggressive legal action. According to their creative accounting, the fines had reached $8,000. I left the meeting and drove straight to my attorney, Michael Harrison. Mike specialized in property law and had handled the paperwork when I inherited the cabin. When I explained the situation, he laughed and said it was the most blatant case of HOA overreach he had seen in 20 years of practice. He immediately sent a cease and desist letter to the board, explaining they had no authority over my cabin and demanding they stop sending notices. Karen responded by having the board vote to impose a special enforcement penalty of $25,000 for what she called willful and repeated non-compliance with community standards. The letter with this penalty was hand-delivered by a process server, as if I were being sued for a serious crime. It stated that if I did not pay within 30 days, the HOA would place a lien against both my properties. Karen had clearly done her research and knew I owned the house in Riverside Estates, even though the cabin was outside her jurisdiction. This was where Karen made her fatal mistake. She got greedy and impatient. Instead of waiting the full 30 days, she filed the lien after just 2 weeks, and she did not only file it against my Riverside Estates house, she also filed it against the cabin, which required her to submit legal documents to the county. The county clerk received documents from Karen claiming the HOA had jurisdiction over the land. Those papers included a sworn affidavit she personally signed stating the property was inside the HOA boundaries. Mike called me the day the lien was filed, and he sounded almost gleeful. He explained that by submitting false documents to the county, Karen had committed felony fraud. This was no longer a simple civil dispute with an overreaching HOA. She had involved the county government and lied on official records. We quickly filed a motion to remove the lien and requested an emergency court hearing while waiting for the date. I dug into her past. I found that in her previous neighborhood, Millerton Heights, she had been kicked off the HOA board for trying to fine a 90-year-old widow over the wrong shade of beige on her mailbox. I also discovered 3 other Lake Morrison property owners had received similar threats from Riverside Estates HOA, despite living nowhere near its borders. The hearing took place on a Thursday morning before Judge Patricia Lawson. The HOA brought in a high-priced city attorney named Richard Blackstone, who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. Karen sat at the defendant's table in her best power suit, pearl necklace, and matching earrings with a leather portfolio embossed with her initials, as if this was a corporate meeting instead of a legal proceeding. Mike laid out our case with precision, showing the property maps, tax records, county boundary lines, and the fraudulent documents Karen had filed. He explained that she knowingly lied to the county clerk in an attempt to extort money from me. The judge listened closely, asking for clarification at times. When the HOA attorney spoke, he claimed it was all a misunderstanding about property lines and that the board truly believed their jurisdiction had expanded by a proper vote. Judge Lawson asked for documentation. Proving this expansion, he shuffled papers and admitted he had none. She then asked Karen if she had personally verified the boundaries before signing the affidavit. Karen began a long speech about community standards and visual impact zones, but the judge cut her off and said she had heard enough. The judge declared the HOA had no jurisdiction over the cabin and that false documents had indeed been filed with the county. She immediately ordered the lien was removed and all fines dismissed, but the judge was not finished. She scheduled a second hearing to decide if criminal charges should be filed for fraud and whether punitive damages were justified. 3 weeks later, the hearing took place, and by then the story had hit local news. The Riverside Estates HOA was scrambling in damage control. 2 board members had already resigned, and the rest were trying to distance themselves from Karen. Several residents came forward to testify about her aggressive tactics and questionable fines. The 3 Lake Morrison property owners I had found also testified about receiving her threatening letters. The district attorney's office had launched an investigation into the fraudulent documents. The prosecutor told the judge that Karen had a long pattern of using her position to intimidate and extort property owners. They uncovered 17 other cases where she had imposed questionable fines that people paid just to avoid the fight. The total amount collected exceeded $40,000 in only 8 months. Judge Lawson ordered the HOA to pay all my legal fees, which totaled $12,000. She also imposed a $50,000 penalty for harassment and attempted extortion, referred the criminal case to the district attorney, and strongly recommended fraud charges. She issued an injunction banning Karen from serving on any HOA board in the county and placed Riverside Estates HOA under court supervision for the next 2 years. Karen sat frozen in her chair as the judge read the judgment. Her face shifted from red to white to a dull gray when the judge mentioned possible criminal charges. Her hands shook so badly she dropped her gold-embossed portfolio, scattering papers across the floor. The final blow came when Judge Lawson announced the State Real Estate Commission would be notified since Karen still held a real estate license. From her time as a property manager, that license would almost certainly be revoked. 6 weeks later, Karen was formally charged with 3 counts of felony fraud and 14 counts of misdemeanor extortion. She took a plea deal that gave her 2 years probation, 300 hours of community service, and $50,000 in restitution to be divided among all the property owners she had wrongfully fined. The look on her face when the judge read the sentence was pure shock, as if she could not grasp how her little empire had collapsed. She even asked the judge if there had been a mistake because she was only trying to maintain property values. The judge stared at her for a long moment before simply saying, "Next case."